an important thing that the Arizona Secretary of State's office did that's worth highlighting here was our efforts to ensure that nonpartisan expert observers had access to the counting floor and that those people could provide regular press briefings about what they saw and how it compared to election audit best practices. So this was critical for helping to both pre-bunk and debunk the mis and disinformation that we knew would come from the Cyber Ninjas exercise. I'll note that given the lack of transparency and the known departures from best practices in terms of actually conducting an election audit, we really struggled at the Secretary of State's office in the early stages of this as to whether we wanted to have any SOS affiliated observers there at all, because we didn't want to legitimize the exercise by having our people there. But because the expert observers weren't granted access on their own and we had to litigate to get that access, we decided ultimately that it was better to have experts there who could speak credibly to the processes being used from their own firsthand experience from being there on the ground rather than having no one there at all. And looking back now, I think that was definitely the right call. Early on, we tapped into the deep network of national election audit experts sharing our concerns and developing relationships with them and keeping them up to speed on what was going on and how we may be able to use their help as the circumstances evolve really rapidly on the ground. I just can't stress enough how thankful we are at the Secretary of State's office to Jennifer Morrell of the elections group, who was one of the Secretary's designated experts, Ryan Macias and Liz Howard from the Brennan Center. Not only were they willing to jump on a plane on short notice, get to Arizona, and be there on the ground, they were diligent throughout the process in providing expert feedback on what they were seeing, keeping the media informed on what they were seeing and how that compared to best practices. And if we hadn't done that legwork to develop those relationships before the audit really took off, we wouldn't have been able to mount the response that we did to all the misinformation that came out of that. So it was critical to us that voters and the public have this insight and information from these credible experts on the review so that they could make informed decisions about the processes that were being deployed and whether what came out of this process was credible or not. So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone who supported the Secretary of State's office in that process.
Thank you, Bo. Now I'm going to go to Karen Brinson Bell of North Carolina. I'd love for you to introduce yourself, and I would also love for you to talk about the voter confidence campaign that the North Carolina State Board of Elections put on with, I think, great effect. I was really interested and jazzed to see that roll out.
Thank you. We're pretty proud of it ourselves. Yes, I'm Karen Brinson Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina State Board of Elections. And I also serve as the chief elections official for North Carolina because we are an independent agency. I'm a full-time elections administrator who reports to an appointed bipartisan board and who are not full-time election administrators. They have other jobs and other roles in their worlds. So they serve in a quasi-judicial sort of framework. And at the county level, where I was previously a county elections director, the county boards also are sort of independent bodies because they work full-time with the direction of a bipartisan elections board. So I've been in elections since 2006. And when I came on as state elections director in June 2019, we at that point, obviously, as the elections profession, had been designated as critical infrastructure. And we knew that some questions had been raised, misunderstanding about how e-poll books work. And we were also in the process of, by state law, DREs were being decertified. And so we needed to certify new voting equipment before a Super Tuesday primary in 2020. So, looking at less than a 6-month turnaround to do that for about a third of our state, including one of our most populous counties. Mm-hmm. We got together and decided we needed to launch a voter confidence campaign. We did not have a crystal ball of what all would be happening in 2020. It was really focused on helping folks understand the critical infrastructure nature of elections and how we secure our elections. And around that campaign, we wanted folks to know the partnerships that we have with Homeland Security, with emergency management, with the North Carolina National Guard Cyber Unit, with North Carolina Department of Information Technology, our, law enforcement officers, you name it, the partnerships that were coming about and how we were working with all 100 county boards of elections in North Carolina to be united in our efforts. And we came through that process. We came up with the hashtag #YourVoteCountsNC. And again, no crystal ball, but how perfect that wound up being to carry us through 2020 and even today. And so we launched that campaign and started telling our story. That's what we knew we needed to do so that people could understand that we don't work behind a curtain and it's not smoke and mirrors, that there are processes in place that have been in place and how methodical we are in ensuring that every vote counts. And from that, we have developed top 10 lists, facts that people can know about how we secure elections. We keep that updated so that they know how we're in continuous improvement to make the processes better for everyone. We started doing a social media campaign that fortunately has increase the number of followers that we have. I know that came up in a previous panel of you can't just have a social media site or page, you've got to have followers and who are retweet and reshare, and we've managed to do that. And we do that every single day. We have something out on social media, be it Mythbusters Monday or Fun Fact Friday or trivia or Elections 101. I mean, we've got an entire campaign as such built out so that people understand, be it that their poll worker is their former teacher or coach, and we profile those folks, or be it that they need to understand that modems are not allowed by law in North Carolina, and make that fact known so that this disinformation that's out there, that we're combating it. And that has carried over even to our website. We revamped our website in 2020 to be more user-friendly and more secure. And we also have one of the largest outlets for election data that I think we have in our entire nation. And we've done that while including a data communications specialist at our agency. And that group, our communications team, who are just phenomenal, they created a combating misinformation page so that all the reports and the data that we analyze, those fact sheets and those reports are always accessible to the public. Once again, just reinforcing the transparency that we want people to know about.
And just a quick personal note, and in my capacity as a data journalism professor, I frequently used your data in my classes. So shout out for that. Thank you.
Sorry if we made life harder on other states.
You make life easier for me.
Well, good.
And this seems like a very proactive approach. And I wonder if you have noticed a difference in the way that the media covers you now that more information is out there that they just have at their fingertips. Are you getting fewer dumb questions that are a waste of your time on election day, or is that just a perennial issue?
I think it definitely has helped us build our relationships out with the media. It's also helped our counties be able to respond effectively. I mean, we have 2 counties that are close to 1 million voters, and then we have counties as small as 2,500 registered voters and one-person offices. So they wear so many hats that being a comm specialist is not something that they can do. So it has helped inform the political parties.
Mm-hmm.
It's helped inform the media. What we hope is that it's helping to inform the public. We are seeing certainly our data shows that we've seen an uptick in public records requests and data requests. I know Recorder Richard was talking about the number of requests that Maricopa County gets, but in 2021, we had over 750 data requests. That's not even our public records requests, which were similarly on par. And already this year, in the first quarter, if we continue to track the way that we are, we will have over 800 data requests this year. So it does help with the relationships with the media.
Mhm.
And we also have set press releases and things that we put out in media kits and so forth, so that they can easily communicate to the public, as well. But I'm not sure, the difficulty is reaching that person who's misinformed or uninformed and making sure that they get that information.
Thank you. And I'd like to return to you, Bo. I know, so I'm going to ask both of you this question. The only unacceptable answer is nothing. If you could do this over again, what would you do differently? If you had, if 20, I mean, Lord help me, if 2020 started over, how would you change your communication and public engagement strategy?
So I've honestly given this quite a bit of thought as to what I would do differently if I could do 2020 again. And like Jessica, I want to be clear that I never want to do 2020 over again in case fate is listening. But if I could, and if I had to, I don't know that there's anything I would or could have done differently within the constraints of what we were operating in then in 2020. Like other states, we faced the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic, the levels of misinformation, threats to election officials, et cetera. But I would say even more so than many other states, in Arizona, the Arizona Secretary of State's office was extremely understaffed and underfunded and under attack politically and otherwise in Arizona. But we managed to deliver for Arizonans 3 free, fair, secure, smooth, and successful elections. And I'm incredibly proud of that. But if I could lift some of the constraints that we were operating under in 2020, if we had the resources and the legislative authorization, I think high on my list operationally would have been to be able to conduct statewide risk limiting audits. Arizona already has post-election hand count audit of election day and early ballots, but the way the statute is currently, the county doesn't conduct it if the parties don't participate, and the audit that is required limits kind of the flexibility and efficacy of the audit. But and it's probably wishful thinking to think that something like that, doing risk limiting audits in 2020, would have fended off the cyber ninjas debacle, but it certainly wouldn't have. But I think it would have given us yet one more tool to point to in assuring our voters that the results of our elections are accurate. And while Arizona has robust election security and integrity procedures in place, there's always room for improvement, and we're always looking for that. And then, of course, if we had unlimited time and resources without the constraints of COVID, I wish we could have done more outreach to voters via town halls and events within the communities and meeting voters where they are, kind of the themes we've heard in the prior 2 panels, identifying those trusted messengers within the communities where it's hard to penetrate and get messages across, and especially to reach voters in tribal and rural areas and those needing voting information in minority languages. But I think with that said, a takeaway for me from 2020 and 2021 that I think everyone here will relate to is that, we can't fight bad information by just putting out more good information. It's incumbent upon election officials to nowadays to do that. As we've said, comms departments have become critical. But in this environment, that's just the starting point, and it can't be the end point. And just simply elevating truthful content just isn't enough to undo or even begin to stem the damage of the disinformation that's out there. There's just this incentive system that's in place that manufactures this broken information environment that we have to operate in. And I think that's kind of a whole of society and whole of government problem that has to be solved. And we need our leaders at the state and federal level to get on that. But in the meantime, election officials will continue to do what we do, which is a whole lot with very little to get information out to our voters.
Thank you. And I believe that Secretary Benson from Michigan is joining us. Will she be popping up? Well, while that's happening, I'm going to go to you. What would you do differently?
Well, you can slap my hand for saying nothing, but I'm going to stick with that, because I am going to proclaim, just as I did the day after our election, it is the most successful election North Carolina has ever had. And I stand proud by that. I stand proud by those folks who worked tirelessly and the number of hours that they put in. And we've got the facts to prove that. We had the highest voter turnout ever in North Carolina. We had a report that we didn't even know was going to come out from the Department of Health and Human Services that said there was no link to COVID. There was no COVID spread linked to voting. That, how can you say that that's something you would change? That is a huge accomplishment. We delivered voting to more absentee by mail voters than we've ever done, while also seeing the largest use of our early voting in-person voting ever. And so when I look at that, you know, we actually had a theme with our conferences going into the elections that centered around the infamous North Carolina State cardiac pack and how they cut down the nets in practice and to prepare for that victory, and how they went through a survive and advance. And we had one of the celebrated players from that team, Derek Wittenberg, to talk to our folks. And so I promised them, I was like, we pulled this off and we're going to have our one shining moment. And we have a montage that celebrates that. So again, I wouldn't do it any differently. And I want folks to start realizing that all the naysayers and all the people who are questioning what we did need to look back and recognize what we did make happen. It doesn't mean that we stopped doing a continuous improvement. It doesn't mean that we didn't do lessons learned, but it's amazing. We conducted elections while voting was going on, and there were ransomware attacks in county government. We kept it going, and we had no issues with election security in a pandemic as well. So I'm going to say nothing, but I'm going to celebrate what we did.
I'll let you have it. Secretary Benson, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to ask you a little bit of a combo question to get you up to speed in the panel. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and then also discuss your Ready for November video series that you did. And then I'm going to have you kind of append on the end of that lessons learned from 2020, what you might do differently if you were forced to do it again, which we hope never happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, I second everything my colleague from North Carolina just said. I think she laid it out beautifully. I mean, we actually had an enormously successful election on every metric, as she just so eloquently, in a data-driven, fact-based way, laid out for everyone. So it's basically ditto in Michigan. We actually, just followed the data and made smart, informed decisions, talking with my colleagues all around the country to, it's one of the reasons why all of us on both sides of the aisle in many states sent out absentee ballot request forms, because in this was an election in which citizens needed to know they had a safe and secure option to vote from home in the midst of a pandemic. And myself and other secretaries of state, Democrats and Republicans, talked about this. And a significant number of us on both sides of the aisle did just that and did it securely. I think what was unfortunate was that what was unfortunate, but also what we knew was going to happen, was that all of our work hit at a time when there was a similar unprecedented effort to overturn the results of the election. And prior to Election Day, really try to undermine people's faith in the process and set the stage for the potential need to challenge election results. Which we also lived through on the other side of the election. But what was remarkable in particular about the 2020 election is that every step of the way, because we had so many partners, because we were all across the country dealing with a lot of the same challenges, and we were all collaborating at the state and federal level as well with CISA more effectively than ever before, we were able to actually have an incredibly successful, smooth election that was so important, because in some states where it was close and in other states where it wasn't, we all had to protect the results. We all had to stand up against efforts to undermine the results, even though we audits and through many other ways, the accuracy of the results stood and was evident for anyone willing to look at the facts. And the last thing I'll say, Jessica, is in regards to the Ready for November series, that was our effort to get ahead of what we knew would be an onslaught of misinformation about our elections, and to provide a series where we knew one of the best antidotes to countering misinformation was educating voters on the front end so that they could spot the lie because they already knew the truth. And then secondly, doing that with trusted messengers. So we partnered with sports leaders, we partnered with business leaders, we partnered with community organizations, faith leaders and others, and election officials to amplify their work at the local level, to simply just provide that data point for anyone with questions about our elections to know all the work that was going into it, and to provide also context content for media outlets that were covering preparations for November. The challenge was actually then making sure that content was connected to people and making sure people actually heard it. And that was particularly challenging in the midst of the pandemic. But a lot of the work we did on the front end to educate voters about their rights, about their options to vote, and about their secure and safe way in which we validate ballots and count every valid vote helped us withstand enough of the pressure that was placed on voters and many officials to overturn or block the certification of election results and ultimately get through that really tumultuous time with our election results intact. That hasn't stopped the attacks, which I'm sure we'll talk about, or have talked about, but they've only really escalated and increased in sophistication since that time. But it's important to note that we came together in 2020, had a successful election on every front possible, and also were able to shore up our security so much that we were able to withstand really an unprecedented, multifaceted, and strategic effort to undermine those elections and those results once they didn't go the way that some people wanted them to.
Thank you. I would like to talk a little bit about sort of proactive efforts to combat misinformation. We've touched on that a little bit, but I'd love to have Bo talk first about the importance of coordinating between counties. Of course, Arizona only has 9. I know 15. That 15. Oh, I'm sorry, 15. And you have 100. Am I correct? So maybe it's a little bit different for the both of you. So I'd like to hear kind of the difference between that sort of model, but let's start with you. Why was it important to coordinate between counties, and what tools did you use to do that?
Mm-hmm. So as many other states did in Arizona, we really leaned into the Trusted Info campaign that was coordinated by the National Association of Secretaries of State to promote election officials as the trusted sources of election information. So we used our social media and every other opportunity to spotlight state and county election officials and to help drive voters directly to their local election officials for the most accurate information about how elections were going to be run in their communities. So alongside that effort to highlight state and local election officials as the credible, verified sources for election information, we also learned the importance of communication between those officials themselves and not just from the officials to the voters, and coordinating messaging from state and local officials about specific instances of mis and disinformation as they arise. If we're telling people to turn to their state and local election officials for trusted information, when a piece of disinformation really takes hold, it just throws fuel on the fire for those officials to be saying different things. Even if they're not really saying different things, but it's just framed differently, it can just throw fuel on that fire of disinformation. So the counties in Arizona, we have 15, thank goodness, but they're very diverse. Maricopa County, who you just heard from, is the second largest voting jurisdiction in the country, while our smallest counties have just a couple thousand registered voters. So their internal comms resources and capacities vary correspondingly. And cognizant of that, the Secretary of State's office really made an effort to offer comms support especially to our smaller counties whenever they needed it, and to promptly communicate with comms staff at all of our counties, especially the larger counties with more developed comms departments when issues arise. We helped our counties. I think Pam mentioned earlier that only about 30% of elections offices have social media handles. We helped our counties set that up that didn't have them, and those that did, we helped them get the verified check so they could have an additional imprimatur of authority and as a trusted source. We also started shortly after 2020 hosting these hour-long monthly comms calls for state and local officials. So our office, the Citizens Clean Elections Commission, which is a unique thing in Arizona that does public financing for candidates, but also is tasked with educating voters about elections. So we pulled Clean Elections in, and then all of the county recorders and elections departments, as well as their comms staff, if they have it. And the purpose of these calls was really simple, and this was in addition to all the other coordination in terms of operations with our counties. So we have weekly and biweekly calls with the counties on general election operations, but this was specifically dedicated to comms and misinformation and disinformation. And the purpose of these calls was simply so that we could share information and get feedback and coordinate when needed in response to mis and disinformation that's emerging. So, heads up, the Secretary of State's office is getting lots of calls about this issue, or this county is hearing a lot of this. And what are other counties hearing it too? What's the most effective way to respond? Is this an issue where a response from the Secretary of State's office would be the most effective? Or is this an issue where the local jurisdiction, the county taking the lead, would be more effective? And how can we coordinate that and be as in sync with each other as we can? So I think these calls, generally on the operational calls, there's some butting of heads and tensions, but on the comms call, it's just been uniformly positively received, incredibly well intended and engaged, and our counties appreciate that. And we would highly recommend it, carving out the time for something like that for states that aren't already doing it.
And how does a state like North Carolina with 100 counties do something like that? Do you?
We do, and there's some similarities, and yet we don't have a playbook for this. We're all learning as we go, I think, is the reality. But I think one of the things we've tried to establish is we even call ourselves Team 101. 100 county boards of elections, one state board of election, working in a collaborative, concerted effort to deliver elections to all eligible voters in North Carolina. We share best practices. We share our communication tools. And we know that the state board's there to support what's happening on the front lines with the counties, because they're the ones who count the ballots. They're the ones who deliver the voting. They're the ones who find those bipartisan officials to work those dusk to dawn or dawn to dusk days. And so we have as well, we've done training opportunities every other week. We have specific training for the county officials. Sometimes it has folks from CISA talking about phishing and how to spot phishing attempts. Sometimes it's a county sharing a best practice of how they've established, a special training program for their poll workers or something of that nature. We call them huddles. So there's that team theme, but it's real. And it is how we get most current information to them that might need emphasis beyond a numbered memo going out or an email going out. And then once voting does start, in-person voting will Monday morning, 8:30, we'll rally together for our stand-up that we call Monday morning kickoffs, so that they know, in a 15-minute window, what's the most urgent, what's the most pressing. And, and sometimes it is. This is the bit of misinformation that's going around right now. This is what we're going to all face. You're probably going to hear from your local media, or we might hear from national media. North Carolina being the 9th most populous state and very purple, and purple before we knew what purple was, means that we do get a lot of attention. And so having that coordinated work approach in our state is really key.
Thank you. And Secretary Benson, I'd love to hear from you about how you manage to coordinate the counties, and it's really not a county issue in Michigan, is it? You've got lots of clerks, and I'd love to hear how you coordinate messaging between them. And I'd also love to hear about the misinformation email address that the Secretary of State set up, that I understand fueled the fact-checking page and maybe influence some of your communication strategy.
On the second point, the misinformation at michigan.gov email gave something memorable and actionable that people could do, something they could take to be empowered to fight misinformation. And that was indeed how we found out about many false robocalls, many specific targeted efforts to confuse voters about their rights or about their options to vote in the lead up to Election Day. And it also enabled us to rapidly respond to them, both by posting something on our website, putting out a release, engaging the Attorney General's office, whatever we needed to do to effectively debunk that misinformation in partnership with the folks on the ground who were receiving it. And in Michigan, we have 83 clerks or 83 counties. So we have 83 county clerks, and then we have about 1,500 local city and township clerks within those counties. The county clerks handle kind of the ballot production, and then they receive the ballots, and the town, in some cases, but in all cases, they receive the results and are charged with communicating them out at the county level. And then at the local level, for the most part, townships and communities actually handle the administration part. And so that's a long established decentralized program in our state, and the clerks themselves have an extraordinary network that they know in order to succeed, they work together. And so our office and the Bureau of Elections within my office simply just plugs into that network and that community and partners with their leadership to make sure we are all aligned. And it's a great thing, because these are folks from both sides of the aisle who are simply, just as election officials are, committed to the work and committed to ensuring elections work for everyone. So we, through proactive communication, which we're actually increasing even more now for this cycle, we were able to partner with them and make sure, in particular, that they had the resources they needed to really meet the moment and deliver a secure and highly accessible election and efficiently tabulate every valid vote in light of all the pressure that all of them are under. Now, of course, then you know, it's actually just up north in Antrim County yesterday, where a long case got dismissed and booted out of court by a judge there, challenging the results. But you know, that shows how, you know, in a decentralized system like that, bad actors can just seize on one example of human error and metastasize it to make it a national story, but also a national plug to, or sword to try to justify misinformation, further misinformation, overturning of election results. So all that's to say is, clearly all the communication still can't, when you have a decentralized system, stop the misuse and abuse in very rare circumstances by outsiders, which is really kind of the new front of what we're working to really embolden and protect our clerks from the pressure that they're receiving from many outsiders who want access to their equipment or other things to further their own partisan agendas. And our clerks remain steadfast, but still, when you have such a broad community, that support, communication, and connectivity is key.
Thank you. I would like to, we have about 7 minutes. So I'd like to turn it over to an audience question. This is from Will Adler at the Center for Democracy and Technology. And he wants to know if Secretary of State's offices have a particular way to communicate with the social media platforms themselves when a particular narrative, piece of misinformation is being spun into chaos. We hear a lot about having a positive communication strategies, but what about flagging narratives directly to the platform so that content can be labeled or de-amplified? And if such a channel doesn't exist, would you want one? Let's start with you, Beau.
So such a channel does exist. We at the Arizona Secretary of State's office had a direct contact at the major social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, through which we could flag pieces of misinformation and inaccurate information about elections. And I think like our comms director could probably speak more specifically to instances, but overall, like our office was pretty pleased with how that flow of information worked in 2020.
Great.
Yeah, it's similar to what Beau said. We do work directly with the platforms. I think that relationship can be built out better because there's still disinformation that we at times requested to be taken down that we didn't see eye to eye on. But we did have some occasions where we worked with those outlets and did have some things removed because they were outright lies and misrepresenting actually the state, or excuse me, a county board of elections. So that certainly couldn't happen either. It was a false page. So there are efforts. It's still not a perfected thing. We could have someone sit and scroll through these platforms all day long and they still wouldn't get up through all of it trying to deal with misinformation. But it's better than it could be.
Feel so hopeful.
Than it has been, yes.
Secretary Benson, how has your relationship with these platforms been?
Yeah, we've been very proactive at developing a connection with them everywhere from LinkedIn and YouTube to Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, because it's critical. And the government relations folks at those various entities have been helpful. And I think we have to really look at the moment that we're in as emerging out of a trying time, but heading into a more trying time. And so the question is, what can we do better that we didn't do as effectively as possible in 2020? And because social media has only become an increasingly, and if Musk buys Twitter, even more so, a space for misinformation to flourish, we need to, I think, be more serious about, as trusted sources of information, partnering with them, just as we partner with many in the media, to ensure they are doing what they can to help us inform the electorate as opposed to misinform.
Thank you. And we have just a couple of minutes left, and I think I'd like to sort of connect all of these dots back to the safety and security of your local election officials and poll workers. And so all of this misinformation doesn't just exist on the internet. It rears its head in real life, and I think in very real ways has risked the safety of your folks. And I'd love to know what steps you're taking ahead of the midterms to shore that up and to help your local officials feel more supported and safe in their jobs. Karen, would you like to kick it off?
I mean, we've had a constant partnership with our emergency management and public safety division, but we have also spent a lot of time this past year trying to foster stronger relationships with our Sheriff's Association and with the Chief of Police Association. We've also been working to look at a technology tool that will help us track and connect the dots between instigators on social media and the people who actually send the hate mail or make the denial of service phone calls to shut down our operations and make accusations that are on the verge of threats if they're not. And so those are the things we're trying to do. We're not there yet. This wasn't where we expected to be. But those partnerships are what have been really crucial, and making sure that those partners understand how elections operate has been really important, because it's interesting when you start looking at your state laws and they aren't election specific, or if they are, that law enforcement doesn't deal with that every day, and making sure that we can be on a coordinated front.
Thank you. Secretary Benson.
Yeah, and similarly, as to what Karen was talking about, it's really, in my view, two fronts. One, strengthening the legislation in our state, strengthening the protections so that it is, so that we're taking these threats against election officials as threats against democracy and dealing with them more seriously. And then secondly, it is the connectivity, whether it's with the Justice Department and the FBI, which we actively partner with, or having conversations with local election officials and their local law enforcement, which is key, the latter of which we're really leaning in on this year for this cycle. That's what it's going to take, because we want to know that in every community in Michigan, if something goes wrong on election day, if there is a threat, if there is violence, that they know exactly who to call and have built that relationship ahead of time. And then similarly, if they are personally threatened, that they also know who they can call and who will be there for them. And so the Justice Department has been very helpful at building and encouraging and incentivizing those relationships and those connections. And we are going to be hosting a meeting next month with local clerks and local law enforcement to begin that conversation about how we can build that connectivity, not just for this year, but for 24 as well.
Thank you. And Bo, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, I just echo what Karen and Secretary Benson said, that it's critical to engage all the partners that have to help support election administration, and bringing in law enforcement and enforcement offices and other agencies in government that can support those efforts to keep election workers safe. So I think in 2020, there was a lot of focus on and building those partnerships in order to be prepared for potential interruptions and voter intimidation at the polls. And now with the increase in threats against election officials, we're kind of continuing to build those partnerships and relationships and lines of communication, but now also with a focus towards protecting the safety of the people who make elections and democracy happen.
And in your new role, what I understand you're going to be providing legal support to elections officials. Will part of that be supporting them if they feel threatened or have legal actions taken against them?
So States United actually has a focus on preventing political violence, and that program is deeply focused on supporting state and local election officials in responding to the increased threat in this environment of threats and harassment that confronts them, including monitoring social media for trends, working on training resources for election officials, et cetera. So yes, I'm thrilled to continue to be able to do that work.
What a great tool. Thank you. Well, that concludes our panel on state innovations. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here today. I really appreciate it.